Steve Harvey had orchestrated countless memorable moments throughout his distinguished career, hosting Family Feud. But the events that transpired on that winter afternoon in January 2025 would fundamentally alter his understanding of marriage, sacrifice, and the hidden dimensions of long-term commitment. The Thompson family from Portland, Oregon, stood assembled on stage for their fast money round, and among them was 95-year-old William Thompson, whose dignified presence and unmistakable sense of gravity immediately distinguished this segment from standard game show proceedings. William approached the podium with measured deliberation, aided by a polished mahogany cane, and the studio audience offered respectful applause that reflected their intuitive recognition that something significant was about to unfold. William presented himself with meticulous attention to appearance. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that had clearly been tailored with care, a crisp white shirt, and a slate blue tie, secured with a silver clip. His white hair was precisely combed, and despite the physical limitations inherent to advanced age, his hazel eyes conveyed remarkable clarity and purposefulness. The Thompson family had achieved victory in the main competition through consistent strong performance across all rounds, and they now required only 74 points in the fast money segment to secure the $20,000 prize. William's great-granddaughter had completed the initial fast money round with a respectable score of 126 points, establishing a foundation that made the family's success appear probable. Steve approached William with his characteristic warmth, though he immediately adjusted his typical energetic style to accommodate the elderly contestant's more deliberate pace. Before beginning the standard fast money questioning sequence, Steve engaged in preliminary conversation, inquiring about William's background and what had motivated the family to pursue this particular opportunity. William's response carried a weight that immediately transcended conventional game, show interaction. He explained in a voice that remained remarkably strong, despite his years, that his wife Catherine had passed away 9 months earlier after 68 years of marriage, and that during her final week of life, she had made him promise to share something with the world if he ever found himself positioned to reach a wide audience. Steve's expression registered immediate recognition of the profound nature of what William had introduced into what was intended as entertainment programming. He asked William to describe Catherine and their decades together. William's response revealed carefully controlled emotion beneath his composed exterior. He described Catherine as an exceptional woman who had demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, resilience, and dedication throughout their marriage. He explained that they had built what everyone who knew them considered an exemplary partnership, raising 5 children while both maintaining successful professional careers and contributing actively to their community. He noted that Catherine had been beloved by everyone who knew her, admired for her grace under pressure and her ability to balance multiple demanding roles with apparent effortlessness. The studio audience grew noticeably quieter as William spoke, and crew members who had witnessed innumerable tapings found themselves drawn into the developing narrative with unusual intensity. Steve asked William whether he wished to share Catherine's request before or after completing the fast money questions. William stated with quiet firmness that Catherine had been explicit regarding the proper sequence. She wanted him to answer the fast money questions first, to demonstrate that their family had achieved stability and success, and only afterward to reveal what she had asked him to communicate to anyone who might hear it. Steve agreed to honor Catherine's specified sequence, and they proceeded with the fast money segment. The questions followed established format, but the atmosphere throughout the studio suggested that all present understood they were participating in something extending beyond standard programming. When asked to name a popular hot beverage, William responded with coffee without hesitation. For something people keep in their wallet, he stated driver's license. When asked how many books people read per year, William answered 5. For a place people go to exercise, he said gym. Finally, when asked to name something people do before bed, William responded with brushing teeth. Each answer was delivered with consistent calm certainty, as though William had prepared through some process extending beyond simple study of common survey responses. As results were revealed, audience engagement intensified with each successive outcome. Coffee claimed the number one position with 42 points. Driver's license secured the top answer with 34 points. 5 books per year earned the number 2 spot with 28 points. Gym as an exercise location claimed the number 1 answer with 36 points. Brushing teeth before bed secured the number 1 position with 33 points. William had accumulated 173 points independently, bringing the family total to 299 points and securing their victory by a substantial margin. The Thompson family celebrated with evident joy, surrounding William with embraces and expressions of pride and affection. However, William himself maintained remarkable composure, accepting their celebration while conveying through his bearing that his primary purpose remained unfulfilled. As initial celebration subsided, William raised his hand in a gesture that, while physically modest, carried sufficient authority to restore immediate silence throughout the studio. William stated clearly that he needed to honor his commitment to Catherine by sharing what she had asked him to reveal. He explained that fulfilling this obligation represented the genuine reason his family had pursued the opportunity to appear on the program, and that everything preceding this moment had been preparation for what he was about to disclose. Steve moved closer to William, his professional instincts recognizing that the emotional center of this entire experience was imminent. He assured William that he commanded everyone's complete attention and should share whatever Catherine had wanted communicated. William took a measured breath, steadying himself with his cane, before beginning to speak. He explained that to understand Catherine's request and its significance, people needed to understand certain facts about their marriage that had remained private throughout their 68 years together. William stated that he and Catherine had married in 1956 when they were both 27 years old. They had met in graduate school, both pursuing advanced degrees in education, and had been drawn to each other by shared intellectual interests, compatible values, and mutual attraction. Their courtship had progressed naturally, and their wedding had been a joyful celebration attended by family and friends, who unanimously agreed that the couple was well matched and likely to build a strong marriage. What no one except Catherine and William knew, what they had never shared with their children or anyone else during Catherine's lifetime, was that Catherine had been in love with someone else when she agreed to marry William. The person Catherine loved was a woman named Margaret, whom she had known since college, and with whom she had maintained an intimate relationship for several years before meeting William. In the 1950s, such relationships were not merely socially unacceptable, but were actively criminalized in many jurisdictions and were universally condemned by mainstream religious and social institutions. Catherine and Margaret had understood that building an open life together was impossible, given the era's attitudes and legal structures. William explained that he had known about Catherine's relationship with Margaret from the beginning. Catherine had told him the complete truth during their courtship, explaining that while she cared for him deeply and believed they could build a good marriage together, her heart belonged to Margaret and always would. Catherine had been forthright that she was choosing to marry William because doing so would allow her to live a conventional life, to have children, to pursue her career without the constant threat of exposure and ostracism that maintaining her relationship with Margaret would entail. She had asked William whether he could accept a marriage built on friendship, respect, and companionship rather than romantic love, and whether he could live with knowing that her deepest emotional connection would always be to someone else. The studio had fallen into absolute silence as William delivered this information. Steve Harvey stood motionless, his expression reflecting the profound weight of what he was hearing. William continued by explaining that he had accepted Catherine's proposition for reasons that were complex, and that he had spent 68 years examining. He had loved Catherine deeply, and had believed that building a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection could create a meaningful marriage, even without the passionate romantic love that conventional narratives suggested was essential. He had also been pragmatic about the realities of their era, understanding that what Catherine offered was perhaps more honest than many marriages built on romantic passion that faded over time into relationships sustained primarily by habit and obligation. William described how Catherine had maintained her relationship with Margaret throughout their marriage, though the nature of that relationship necessarily changed given Catherine's commitment to her marriage and family. Margaret had remained Catherine's closest confidante, the person she turned to for emotional support and deep conversation, the person who understood dimensions of her identity and experience that William, despite his best efforts, could never fully comprehend. William had accepted this arrangement, had facilitated Catherine and Margaret's continued friendship, and had even developed his own genuine affection for Margaret over the decades as he witnessed how much her presence in Catherine's life contributed to Catherine's well-being and happiness. The confession that Catherine had asked William to share was not simply that she had loved someone else throughout their marriage, though that fact itself contradicted conventional assumptions about what constituted a successful marriage. Catherine's request was that William explain to the world that their marriage had been genuinely happy and successful, despite being built on a foundation that most people would consider inadequate or dishonest. Catherine wanted people to understand that marriage could take many forms, that different arrangements could work for different people, and that rigid adherence to narrow definitions of what marriage should be often caused unnecessary suffering for people whose needs and circumstances did not conform to conventional expectations. Catherine had been explicit with William about her reasons for wanting this information shared after her death. She had spent 68 years living what appeared to be a conventional heterosexual marriage, while maintaining an identity and emotional life that contradicted that appearance. She had done so because the era in which she lived provided no viable alternative, and she had made peace with the compromises required by her circumstances. However, Catherine had watched societal attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity evolve dramatically during her final decades, and she had witnessed younger generations claiming identities and building lives that would have been impossible when she was young. Catherine wanted her story shared as a testament to the hidden lives that countless people of her generation had lived, the compromises they had made, and the emotional complexity they had navigated in silence. She wanted younger people to understand the privilege inherent in being able to live openly and authentically, a privilege purchased through the sacrifices of previous generations who could not do so themselves. She wanted to challenge assumptions about what constituted a real marriage or a successful relationship, suggesting that arrangements built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care could be valid even when they departed from conventional romantic ideals. Most importantly, Catherine wanted William honored and recognized for the extraordinary person he had been throughout their marriage. She had asked him to share this story not to diminish what they had built together, but to illustrate that he had chosen to build a life with her, knowing the full truth of her circumstances and her heart. She wanted the world to know that William had loved her enough to accept her as she actually was, rather than requiring her to pretend to be someone she was not, and that this acceptance had been an act of profound generosity that had shaped both of their lives and the lives of their children in fundamental ways. William's voice remained steady as he explained that he had agreed to share this information despite considerable personal discomfort, because honoring Catherine's final request mattered more than protecting his own privacy or managing how others might perceive him or their marriage. He stated that he wanted people to understand that his decision to marry Catherine, knowing she loved someone else, had not been self-sacrificing martyrdom, but rather a conscious choice to build a particular kind of partnership with someone he admired and cared for deeply. He acknowledged that their arrangement would not have been right for everyone, but insisted that it had been right for them, and that the life they had built together had been rich, meaningful, and genuinely happy. Steve Harvey stood completely still for an extended period, visibly processing what he had heard. When he finally moved, it was to walk several steps away from William and the cameras, his hand covering his mouth as he struggled to control his emotional response. The audience remained in absolute silence, and crew members stood frozen in their positions, recognizing that standard professional protocols were inadequate for responding to what had just occurred. After nearly 2 minutes, Steve returned to William with visible tears in his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of his typical performance energy, but rather reflected authentic human response to profound revelation. Steve stated that William's confession and Catherine's message had shattered multiple assumptions he had held about marriage, love, sacrifice, and what it meant to build a life with another person. He explained that he had always believed that romantic love was the essential foundation for successful marriage, and that marriages lacking that foundation were fundamentally compromised, regardless of what other positive qualities they might possess. Hearing William describe a 68-year marriage that had been genuinely happy and successful, despite being built on different premises, had forced him to reconsider beliefs he had never previously questioned. Steve addressed the audience and cameras directly, explaining that William's story illustrated forms of love and commitment that conventional narratives rarely acknowledged or valued. He spoke about how William had demonstrated extraordinary capacity to love Catherine, not by requiring her to conform to his needs or expectations, but by accepting her authentic self and building a life that honored her reality rather than demanding she pretend to be someone she was not. He emphasized that this form of love, built on acceptance and facilitation of another person's well-being, even when doing so required personal compromise, represented a profound challenge to cultural assumptions about what love should look like. Steve then asked William's children, all adults in their late 50s and 60s, whether they had known about their mother's orientation and her relationship with Margaret. The oldest son, Daniel, stepped forward and explained that they had learned the truth 6 months earlier when their father had shared it with them after Catherine's death. Daniel described the initial shock and confusion of learning that fundamental aspects of their parents' marriage had been different from what they had always assumed. He explained that the family had spent considerable time processing this information, talking through their feelings with each other and with therapists, and working to integrate this new understanding into their existing memories and relationships. Daniel stated that learning about their mother's orientation and the true nature of their parents' marriage had not diminished their respect for either parent, but rather had deepened their appreciation for the complexity both had navigated throughout their lives. He described feeling profound gratitude for his father's acceptance of his mother and recognition that William's willingness to build a marriage on unconventional terms had enabled all 5 children to exist and to be raised in a stable, loving home. Daniel also expressed appreciation for understanding his mother more fully, recognizing dimensions of her experience that he had never previously considered, and gaining insight into why certain aspects of her personality and choices had manifested as they did. William's daughter Jennifer spoke next, describing how learning about her mother's relationship with Margaret had actually explained numerous things that had seemed slightly unusual during their childhood, but that they had never questioned. She explained that Margaret had been a constant presence in their family life, someone who attended holidays and celebrations, and who had been affectionately referred to as Aunt Margaret, despite having no biological relationship to the family. Jennifer described how her mother and Margaret had taken regular trips together, how they had spoken on the phone almost daily, and how Margaret had been one of the first people her mother called during moments of crisis or celebration. Jennifer stated that in retrospect, the depth of her mother's connection to Margaret was obvious, but that as children they had simply accepted it as normal, without recognizing its true significance. The remaining children shared similar reflections, each describing how this new information had required them to re-examine their understanding of their family history, while ultimately reinforcing, rather than undermining, their positive feelings about their parents and their childhood. The cumulative effect of these testimonies illustrated how Catherine's decision to live a conventional life, while maintaining her authentic emotional connections, had created a family environment that was genuinely healthy and supportive, even though it was built on foundations different from what it appeared. Steve Harvey announced that his foundation would be establishing the Catherine Thompson Legacy Project, focused on documenting and preserving the stories of LGBTQ individuals who had lived closeted lives during eras when being open was impossible or dangerous. He explained that Catherine's story represented countless other stories that had never been told, and that preserving these narratives was essential for helping younger generations understand the history of LGBTQ experience and the evolution of societal attitudes. Steve stated that the Thompson family's $20,000 prize would serve as the initial contribution to this project, and he committed his foundation to providing substantial additional funding. Steve acknowledged that this initiative would likely generate controversy given ongoing cultural debates about sexual orientation, gender identity, and family structure. However, he insisted that Catherine's message and William's willingness to honor her request demonstrated the importance of acknowledging historical realities, even when those realities challenged comfortable narratives. He stated that he had been moved by William's demonstration of what genuine acceptance looked like, and that this example had challenged him to examine whether his own professed beliefs about love and acceptance were actually reflected in his attitudes and actions. The episodes broadcast 3 weeks later generated immediate and intense response across multiple platforms and communities. Social media conversations reflected deep divisions, with some viewers praising William and Catherine's honesty while others criticized them for what was characterized as living a lie or deceiving their children. LGBTQ organizations and advocates celebrated the attention brought to the hidden histories of people who had lived closeted lives, noting that Catherine's story provided important historical context for understanding contemporary LGBTQ rights and the progress that had been achieved through generations of struggle and sacrifice. Religious communities demonstrated varied responses based on theological perspectives regarding sexual orientation and marriage. Progressive religious organizations embraced Catherine's story as illustrating the importance of acceptance and the harm caused by rigid enforcement of narrow definitions of acceptable relationships. Conservative religious organizations expressed concern that the story appeared to validate arrangements that departed from traditional religious teaching regarding marriage and sexual ethics. These divergent responses reflected broader theological debates about how religious communities should respond to LGBTQ individuals and relationships. Educational institutions incorporated William and Catherine's story into curricula addressing LGBTQ history, family studies, and social change. University professors assigned students to analyze the ethical dimensions of Catherine's choices, the implications of living closeted lives, and the social factors that made such choices necessary during certain historical periods. High school teachers used the story to facilitate discussions about how societal attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity had evolved, and what responsibilities current generations had to acknowledge and learn from historical experiences of marginalized communities. Mental health professionals noted that Catherine's story illustrated important points about identity, authenticity, and the psychological impact of living closeted lives. Therapists working with LGBTQ clients of older generations reported that Catherine's story had prompted many clients to share their own experiences of compromise and concealment, often for the first time. These professionals emphasized that Catherine's decision to reveal her story posthumously validated the experiences of many people who had made similar choices and helped younger generations understand the context within which those choices had been made. 6 months after William's appearance on Family Feud, the program produced a follow-up segment providing updates on the Catherine Thompson Legacy Project's development. The segment featured interviews with several older LGBTQ individuals who had lived closeted lives for decades and who had been inspired by Catherine's story to share their own experiences. One man in his 80s described maintaining a 40-year marriage to a woman while secretly identifying as gay, and explained how Catherine's story had given him permission to acknowledge this history with his adult children. A woman in her 70s shared her experience of living a conventional, heterosexual life while maintaining a decades-long relationship with a female partner, and described how Catherine's example had helped her children understand her choices with greater compassion and less judgment. The follow-up segment also included Margaret's perspective, as she had agreed to be interviewed about her relationship with Catherine and the arrangement that had shaped both of their lives. Margaret, now 93 years old, spoke with remarkable clarity about the painful realities of being lesbian during the mid-20th century. She described how she and Catherine had recognized that building an open life together was impossible, given societal attitudes and legal structures of that era, and how they had made the painful decision that Catherine would marry William while they maintained their relationship in whatever form circumstances permitted. Margaret stated that she had never regretted supporting Catherine's decision to marry, because doing so had enabled Catherine to have children and build a career without constant fear of exposure and persecution. Margaret also spoke about William with evident affection and respect, describing him as an exceptional man who had treated her with kindness and dignity throughout the decades. She explained that William had never tried to interfere with her relationship with Catherine, and had actually facilitated their continued connection in ways that demonstrated extraordinary generosity. Margaret noted that not all women in Catherine's position had partners willing to accept such arrangements, and that William's acceptance had been essential to making their unconventional family structure sustainable over 68 years. William appeared in the follow-up segment, looking somewhat more frail, but expressing satisfaction with the responses to Catherine's story. He stated that Catherine would have been pleased to know that sharing their experience had prompted conversations about hidden LGBT histories, and had encouraged other people to share their own stories. William emphasized that Catherine's request had not been motivated by desire for recognition or sympathy, but rather by hope that their experience might contribute to greater understanding of the diversity of human relationships and the limitations of rigid categorization. The segment concluded with Steve Harvey reflecting on how the experience had influenced his thinking about marriage, love, and the various forms that meaningful relationships could take. He described the process of developing the Catherine Thompson Legacy Project as educational, requiring him to learn about LGBTQ history and to confront assumptions he had held about what constituted authentic relationships. He stated that William's appearance had been profoundly impactful, precisely because it had challenged comfortable certainties and required him to recognize complexity that simple categorizations could not capture. William Thompson passed away peacefully 14 months after his Family Feud appearance, Having lived long enough to see the Catherine Thompson Legacy Project collect and preserve dozens of stories from older LGBTQ individuals who had lived closeted lives, his funeral attracted substantial attendance, including many people from the LGBTQ community who felt deep gratitude for his willingness to share Catherine's story and his own experience. Speakers at the funeral emphasized William's integrity, his capacity for acceptance, and his demonstration that love could take forms that departed from conventional romantic ideals while remaining genuine and valuable. The Catherine Thompson Legacy Project continues to operate and expand, having documented hundreds of stories from older LGBTQ individuals and created an archive that provides important historical context for understanding LGBTQ experience across different generations. The project has partnered with universities and research institutions to ensure that stories are preserved and made available to scholars, educators, and community members interested in LGBTQ history. Each person who shares their story with the project is asked to reflect on what living closeted meant for their psychological well-being, their relationships, and their sense of identity, creating a nuanced record of the costs and coping strategies associated with concealment. Steve Harvey references William's appearance regularly in discussions about his career's most impactful moments, describing the experience as fundamentally challenging to his assumptions about relationships and human complexity. He has stated that witnessing William fulfill Catherine's request taught him that authentic emotional response sometimes required abandoning professional composure, and that his visible emotional reaction had been appropriate for the gravity of what William had shared. The experience has influenced Steve's approach to his platform, encouraging him to create space for stories that challenge conventional thinking and that illustrate the diversity of human experience beyond simple categorizations. The story of William and Catherine Thompson, and the confession she insisted be shared, continues to resonate in discussions about LGBTQ history, marriage, authenticity, and the various forms that meaningful relationships can take. Catherine's decision to live a conventional life while maintaining her authentic identity and relationships in whatever forms circumstances permitted illustrates the compromises that many LGBTQ individuals of earlier generations made, and the psychological costs of those compromises. William's acceptance of Catherine's full reality and his willingness to build a marriage that honored her authentic self, rather than requiring conformity to conventional expectations, demonstrates that genuine love can manifest in diverse ways beyond romantic passion. Their story challenges simplistic narratives about marriage, authenticity, and what constitutes a successful relationship, suggesting that arrangements built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care deserve recognition even when they depart from conventional ideals.